I love to visit my grandparents in the countryside during the summer. They have lived there all their lives and didn't want to move to a big city, and I can understand why. The air is clean, there are forests, fields, and a river nearby. Next to our village, there is a large old ruin covered with hazelnut and willow bushes. It's ancient. It has been smoldering for half a century since the fire. People avoid that place and try not to pass by it in the dark. There are rumors circulating about it, and they are not good. When I was a child, I was curious and asked my grandma and grandpa what happened at that place. They didn't want to tell me for a long time, but I managed to persuade them since I was persistent by nature. Grumbling, the old folks started their tale. Back then, my grandparents were still young. In the place where now there are only chimney pipes and ancient brickwork, there was a village. No more than 20 houses. It was tiny. It was located right next to a dense forest. During the war, partisans hid there. They hid so well that not a single Fritz could smoke them out, and they didn't even try. If you went in, you wouldn't come back. The thickets were so impenetrable, and there were wild boars, wolves, and bears roaming around. The gray ones were mischievous. They would snatch goats, chickens, and chicks from the outskirts of the yards. That's why we only ventured into the forest for firewood when it was daylight, and we always carried a rifle with us, just in case. My grandparents' father, well, once he came across a lone boar. He didn't hesitate. He took a shot right between the eyes and made a good winter hat out of its wolf fur. So the people and the wolves lived in a fragile neutrality until one day the village chief's little daughter went missing. She was playing on the meadow near the forest. Her mother had strictly forbidden her to venture into the wilderness. The daughter was clever, obedient, and treated her parents with respect. She couldn't have disappeared on her own. All the men, without exception, grabbed their rifles, prepared themselves, and went to comb through the thickets. They shot every gray creature they encountered. They skinned them and moved on. They had shot down more than 24 when they stumbled upon a torn little girl's dress, soaked in blood, with a clump of hair lying nearby, ripped right from the skin. Fear engulfed them. With heavy hearts, the men turned back, carrying the fatal news to the village chief's house. The mother screamed. She rushed into the thicket, and that was the last they saw of her. The father, upon learning that his daughter was gone, sat on a bench and remained there for 3 days. He didn't eat, didn't drink, didn't speak. On the 4th day, they took him down from the noose in his own barn. The whole village attended the funeral. They placed the daughter's dress in the coffin. They buried the chief behind the cemetery, by the roadside, like a sinner, and they sang the mother's requiem. On the 9th day, there was no more life for the people. The villagers would close their windows with shutters, latch their gates, and sprinkle holy water on their doors and windows before nightfall. No one, even in the direst need, would step outside into the darkness. With the arrival of night, the village was visited by unclean spirits. People trembled in fear, hearing something loudly thumping on roofs, scratching at doors, hissing through chimney pipes. Sometimes, there were cries so eerie and mournful that it sent shivers down their spines. No one dared to glance outside, beyond the window, beyond the sturdy door. They quivered in terror until the first crow of the roosters. If someone dared to raise their voice and sing, everything fell silent and calmed down. This went on for a couple of weeks. Not being fools, the people realized what was happening. Village chief was causing mischief. Well, what could they do about it? He wasn't buried in a Christian manner, but he took his own life, and there was nothing to be done about that. No one wanted to go out on the night watch. It was just too terrifying for everyone. They managed as best they could, saying prayers and performing rituals to protect their households. But one day a calamity, wicked and bitter, befell the village. It happened at night. My grandmother was already awake when she heard a piercing scream from behind the door. The cries were so intense, she said, as if someone were being slaughtered alive. I tumult arose outside. The villagers rushed out, casting aside their fears, to come to the aid and find out what was happening. And so, My grandmother gathered her wits and hurried out with the rest of the household into the yard. The cries were coming from the outskirts, precisely from the side where the village bordered the forest. The screams had subsided. Only the murmurs of the crowd remained, and the flickering lights of kerosene lamps pierced the darkness. As she approached, my grandmother heard frantic wailing, weeping, and agitated speech. The people had surrounded a figure lying on the ground. Squeezing her way between them, my grandmother almost lost consciousness. The light from the lamps illuminated Matvey Petrovich, an old servant who had endured 2 wars. He was lifeless. My grandmother said his abdomen had been torn open, his face mutilated, and his neck severed. She moved away from the crowd and felt a wave of nausea overwhelm her. After coughing and regaining her composure, she listened to the conversations among the people. They can't find their granddaughter. She's gone. God Almighty. Dear God, Iriska, my little flower. Where is Iriska? Iriska. At that moment, a collective uproar erupted, and a shriek pierced the air, causing my grandmother's blood to freeze in her veins. It was her neighbor screaming. Her eyes were wide open, her mouth agape. She extended her hand and pointed ahead of her. Everyone stared in that direction, and what they saw made some people fall to the ground and cover their faces with their hands. Women wailed and writhed on the ground, while the elderly crossed themselves and uttered, "Vanish, foul creature." My grandmother witnessed something hunched running across the moonlit meadow. It was pale like a drowned person, with disheveled hair. It ran swiftly but clumsily, stumbling and looking back. According to my grandmother's account, that face lacked anything human. It was smeared with blood and contorted in an expression of indescribable pain, and its white eyes burned with bestial hatred. As it turned around one last time, it let out a howl that contained all the torments of the afterlife. In that same moment, my grandmother lost consciousness because she saw it cradling a child's head in its arms. It was Iriska. On that same morning, after burying Iriska and Matvey Petrovich, the villagers dug up the grave of the vampire. They dismembered the body into pieces and burned it while reciting purification prayers, and then they set the village ablaze. That's how it stands now, overgrown with tales of horror. Not far away, our village was established, bearing the memory of the past misfortune. They built a small church and found a priest. Since then, there has been no presence of the unclean spirits.